Getting up early has its rewards, like the great taste of a McDonald's breakfast platter. Choose the delicious platter that fits your appetite at McDonald's in the morning. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba, I'm loving it.
Hello guys and welcome back to a new episode of the Italian Politician of the Week. I am Ipernick, the great is silent, and today we're talking about Francesco Cossiga, Prime Minister, Senator for Life and President of the Republic from 1985 to 1992. Cossiga will be the first head of state to get an episode on the series. I have made this decision because his video on Italian presidents does not give him justice. I actually remember cutting some parts out of the video to make it more fluid, but honestly I still believe it's probably the worst in the series. And you know why? Because his term as president is far from his political peak. The funniest moments in his career span throughout the 90s and early 2000s, and those are what he's remembered for today, aside of the more controversial aspects of his career before his term as president. If you like my series, remember to like, subscribe and check out the Discord and subscribe star links. It really helps me stay motivated while making these videos. Now let's get into Cossiga's eventful career. Cossiga is a descendant of a wealthy family in Sardinia. Many of his relatives, close and distant, are actually politicians of their own. President Antonio Segni was his uncle, and leader of the PCI, Enrico Berlinguer, was his cousin. Given his family connections, it is not hard to explain how he got into politics when he was very young. He joined the Christian Democratic Party when he was just 17, and began his political career by founding the Christian Young Turks, a small current in the Sardinian DC which was made out of young people who were a bit more liberal and progressive. The goal of the group was ultimately to break the very conservative status quo of the old Christian Democratic establishment, and they succeeded by winning the 1956 provincial elections in Sassari, Cossiga's hometown. This stunt gave Cossiga and his friends a lot of notoriety, and it is with that same energy that he ran for parliament in 1958, where he remained until 1983. Cossiga eventually climbed up the ladder, becoming Undersecretary of Defense in 1966, Minister of Internal Affairs in 1976, and Prime Minister in 1980. Now, I consider Cossiga one of the most interesting, unique, and even controversial personalities of Italian history, and that label certainly does not come by beating a bunch of walking corpses in a provincial election. Cossiga was not only an ambitious politician, but also, as he will later admit, a political referent to the Gladio organization, the Italian branch of Stay Behind, the secret paramilitary organization in NATO which had the duty to stop the communist parties from rising up and to take over capitalist countries. Segni was particularly paranoid about this danger and even encouraged his colleagues to keep guns and grenades in their offices at all times, you know, just in case Castro knocked at the door and forced them to feed his dairy addiction. The 60s were tense, and you can find out more about it in Moro's and Segni's videos, but even at the peak of tension it was clear that the communists and socialists had no intention to topple the republic that they themselves had helped to create. Segni's paranoia was just a sign of his deteriorating mental health, which is what eventually led him to resign 5 years before the end of his mandate in 1964. While Gladio itself was generally perceived as harmless, this did not stop some people to commit legit crimes in the name of anti-communism. General De Lorenzo's Plan Solo is a perfect example. If we reach 30 likes, I will add them to a future poll, but if we make it to 50, I will just make him Italian Politician of the Week next month. So basically Cossiga was one of the political representatives of Gladio in government, and therefore he played an instrumental role at the Ministries of Defense and Interior Affairs. Despite his outright confession of being part of a Cold War secret paramilitary organization, Cossiga is still overshadowed in every way by Andreotti, who probably was part of hundreds of secret organizations but never admitted to it. They ran the country alongside each other for years, during which Andreotti Andreotti did most of the sketchy things, but Cossiga still managed to attract some controversy. His actions during Moro's kidnapping are the more interesting ones in my opinion. The government at the time formed 2 commissions to deal with the issue. The only problem was that most of the members were part of P2, which is not promising at all. Cossiga called for an American journalist to report on the crisis. The man who was sent was Steve Ipernick, who will later write the Tom Clancy novels. He had this to say about what went down. There was one thing that emerged very clearly, and that astounded me. I did not know the man Aldo Moro, so I wanted to get an idea of who he was and how much resistance he had. I found myself in this room full of generals and politicians, all people who knew him well, and, well, in the end, I had the distinct feeling that none of them liked Moro, including Cossiga. It was clear that I wasn't talking to his allies. After a while, I realized that what was happening in the meeting room was seeping out. I knew this because there were those, even the Red Brigades, who issued statements that could only originate from within our group. There was a leak, and a very serious one. One day I told Cossiga directly, "There is an infiltration from above, from far above." "Yes," he replied, "I know from very high up, but how far he didn't know, or maybe he didn't want to tell me." Chances are that Ipernick was talking about P2, but he didn't know just yet. Also, I forgot to mention that yes, he is a journalist, but at the time he was a secret agent. Cossiga never denied these accounts when they were first released in the 90s, although he did say they were a bit overblown, which was likely the case since this was one of the many ways the journalist tried to advertise his work. Though the point stands. Moro sent a lot of letters to the main politicians at the time. Cossiga was certainly one of them. However, the one letter Cossiga received, he thought it was a fake, and so he never addressed it. In the letter, Moro asked Cossiga to drop it and to negotiate with the terrorists for his freedom because he feared for his own life. Thinking that terrorists had actually fabricated the letters, Cossiga did not go through with the negotiations, and so when Moro was found dead, it was devastating for Cossiga. He will resign from his post and leave for Sardinia, where he stayed in isolation for more than a year. When I say it was devastating, I really mean it. He aged at least 5 years, grew depressed, and blamed himself for what had happened. Then, in 1979, he received a call from Sandro Pertini, the president of the Republic at the time. Andreotti had resigned, and Italy needed a new prime minister. Cossiga's 2 governments between 1979 and 1980 were not very stable, nor efficient. That's because Cossiga was like a magnet for controversy. Not only did the Ustica plane crash take place, where an Italian plane full of civilians was shot down by the military because they thought Gaddafi was in it, but when the son of Senator Donat Katyn was about to be arrested for being part of a fascist terrorist group, Cossiga was caught informing the senator about his imminent arrest, allowing him to escape. Cossiga ultimately resigned, not being able to keep the parliamentary majority intact, though it did leave a promising impression on the other parties, who despite the controversies still respected Cossiga for his intellect, honesty, and heart. It is for that very reason that in 1985 he was voted President of the Republic. His first few years as president were relatively uneventful, and he mostly kept for himself. However, something snapped at the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Cossiga is a politician which is hard to understand. Some might disagree, but this is my view on the situation. Due to his past and youth, he did not really have the option of not being loyal to the institutions, because if he had tried to abandon them, he could have been killed, since he knew a lot about secret organizations and therefore he stuck around. He even tried to damage control, but his conscience caught up to him eventually. Just like Andreotti, he knew that the corrupt institutions can only exist in a Cold War world. So, when the Berlin Wall fell and things started to unfreeze, Cossiga broke the chains and started to fight back. The leaders of the Pentapartito, such as Andreotti and Gramsci, wanted a president who was not as interventionist and popular as Pertini, who would just sit down and do nothing. But when Cossiga started questioning laws after laws and pretending demanding drastic institutional reforms, Andreotti tried to silence him by making Gladio documents public in order to discredit him. In retaliation, Cossiga said even more about the organization and released even more documents. Then he got personal. He began legit roasting and making fun of everyone from Occhetto to Berlusconi in an attempt to ridicule the institutions that he had served for years. While he never explicitly said that the party system was corrupt to the core, he drove the public opinion towards mistrust, and this same mistrust turned into excitement when Di Pietro started clean hands and sent thousands of people to jail. Cossiga will resign shortly after the end of his term in 1992 in protest, and since he was still pretty young, he decided to make his own party and continue his political career in the Berlusconi era. Now, the Second Republic and its parties are not really characterized by their ideology, rather by the personality behind it. Sure, there were exceptions, namely Craxi or Panella, but the Second Republic was more of a competition of egos. Forza Italia was Berlusconi's party, the PDS was D'Alema's party, Lega was Bossi's, RC was Bertinotti's, and so on. Cossiga initially just kinda stood in the sidelines and voted in favor of the current governments that came after his resignation, namely Amato's, Ciampi's, Berlusconi's and Dini's cabinets. Then, in the 1996 elections, he formed a small alliance with the remnants of Democrazia Cristiana, the Liberals and the Social Democrats. This group, initially called CDU-CDR New Italy, will unite in 1998 in a party, the Democratic Union of the Republic. Among its 60 members in parliament, we have people like Clemente Mastella, Mario Segni and Rocco Buttiglione. The party played a very big role in keeping Prodi's government afloat and allowing it to pass the laws we needed to get into the European Union. Cossiga was more than happy to cover the back of a former DC colleague like Prodi. However, there were many things they disagreed on, namely foreign policy. Whenever Prodi or D'Alema expressed resentment towards the US and favored the Chinese economic policies, Cossiga would just go eat at McDonald's in protest. Yep, you heard that right. It quickly became a recurring event. In fact, there are many pictures of Cossiga enjoying a happy meal. Despite the occasional disagreements, Cossiga actually had pretty good relations with the center-left, and when Prodi's governments eventually fell because Bertinotti had a sudden burst of main character syndrome, he suggested D'Alema to become prime minister, hence making him the first former member of the Communist Party to become prime minister. For the occasion, Cossiga gave the new head of government in parliament a baby made out of sugar to make fun of the cliché about cannibalistic customs among communists. However, chances are that D'Alema actually ate the baby, so after just 1 year, the UDR broke apart, and a large part of it merged into the new political entity created by Clemente Mastella, the UDEUR, okay? Cossiga joined it too initially, but then in 2003 he left and joined the mixed group for autonomous regions. Here he didn't do much, except when in 2006 he proposed a constitutional decree for Sardinian independence based. He will die in 2010 relatively peacefully, but I really have to say that in the last 4 years of his death he gave out a bunch of suspicious statements, like when he said that the Bologna massacre at the central station was actually made by Palestinian terrorists, which doesn't make a lot of sense. I guess age took a toll on him, and the cheeseburgers certainly did not help. That being said, I think that is all for season 4. I know this season finale might seem abrupt, but seeing that Italy will be electing our new head of state very soon, I figured that I will be very busy making videos on that in the next few weeks, so stay tuned for updates and other quick videos in the coming days. Season 5 will probably be back next month or whenever things calm down. Have a nice day, guys. I will see you next time.